Hey, welcome back, everybody. I have a returning guest, and I'm real excited that Dr. Gleb contacted me about his new book and wanted to see if you can get time on my podcast. And I said, absolutely. And the title of the new book is Returning to the Office and Lending. Excuse me, let me take that back. So, guys, edit this for me. Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, a manual on benchmarking to best practices for competitive advantage. And that title in itself has a lot in it, but there's a lot to this, Dr. Gleb. So first and foremost, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend some time on my podcast.
Thank you for welcoming me, Peter. Really appreciate it.
So this is interesting. This whole concept of what you're talking about is part of this, as people have described it, the Great Resignation. Mm-hmm. And I'm so curious about this. So I know you've done a tremendous amount of research on this topic. Can you share some of those statistics with the audience?
Happy to. So yes, it's the Great Resignation. But when we're thinking about this Great Resignation, what I strongly encourage, and I helped 17 companies and organizations transition back to the office in this context. So I encourage them not to think of this as a pain point, but as a serious opportunity to seize competitive advantage. And we'll talk about how to do that. But you don't want to think of this simply as a huge pain point to avoid, because you want to think of it as an opportunity, you'll get much further. But let's talk about the statistics. So when we look at the statistics, I talked in the book, I did a meta-analysis of 8 major surveys from organizations like the Harvard Business School and the Society for Human Resource Management. So organizations that don't have a particular stake in the outcome, major surveys. And what they found was that there's a very strong desire for people to have substantial remote work. So the surveys on average found that anywhere from 80 to 85%, depending on the survey, of the respondents want substantial remote work at least half the work week. 25 to 35% of all respondents want full-time remote work. Only something like 10 to 20% of respondents want full-time in the office. So this is very clear where the future is heading. The future is going to be, because the remaining people, 55 to 65%, want hybrid. So that is really where the future is heading. And we'll talk about what hybrid means. Now, what we need to understand is that this is something people really want. It's not like they're just saying it. People really want this. So we see that in the surveys, anywhere from 40 to 55% of the respondents would be willing to leave a company if they're not given their preferred flexible work schedule. And over 70%, 70 to 80% are more likely to stay. And this is the critical factor. People are perceiving flexibility as more important than healthcare, insurance benefits, and other sort of typical perks and benefits. Flexibility is the number one thing that people want in the future, in right now, the future of work. So that is fundamentally important. They're willing to give up serious money for it. So we see that people who want to go back to the office are not willing to give up any money for it, but it ranges from, they're willing to give up 20 to 30% of their salary for full-time remote work, for people who want full-time remote work. So that's a lot of money that people are willing to give up to get the kind of flexible schedule that they want. So we're seeing very clear indicators. And there's other research I can talk about, but I want to let you get in a word sideways.
That's okay. I was just thinking, I came across an article that PwC has now basically put a policy in place. If you were to work full-time remote, you can. And this is only for the U.S. Contingency, the U.S. employees. The interesting thing I found out about as I was reading this article, that if you decide that you want to work remotely, you can live anywhere. However, your pay may be cut if you're living in a place that has a lower cost of living than where you currently are, or so I'm thinking about like New York City. If you're working in New York and you decide to go out into the country and live, you gotta be prepared they're gonna cut your pay on that.
Yeah.
Which I think is fair.
Sure. So happy to talk about that. So again, I helped 17 organizations transition, and this is definitely a consideration. COLA, cost of living adjustment pay. Now, I strongly don't recommend that organizations actively cut the pay of people who are remote, but I do recommend that there is a cost of living adjustment, which needs to, of course, be fair to people. And
Right.
so what I recommend it takes place is that this is addressed through future promotions. So they get less of a promotion, less of bonuses and so on in the future, depending on the cost of living. So that is something that's fair, but people having their pay cut is likely to lead to them being unhappy and then quite possibly resigning. So this is something for companies to be seriously thinking about. So that's one dynamic in terms of pay. Another thing I talk about to companies in terms of pay that actually surprisingly few companies do, 25% apparently, is actually funding people's home offices. So funding people's home offices is incredibly important. And what I usually recommend companies do is do something like 3,000 for an initial transition and then 2,000 for each year afterward, with additional 500 for working parents. And this is for everything from laptop to lighting to microphones to camera, ergonomic furniture, room separators, soundproofing, all of that sort of stuff, and stipends for internet and so on. This is really important because the future is going to be mostly hybrid. So realistically speaking, most people will be coming in 1 to 2 days a week. There'll be some proportion that's going to be fully remote, maybe 10 to 20% of your workforce. The rest is going to be coming in 1 to 2 days a week. That means that the large majority of employees are going to do their work at home. So you want to maximize their productivity, comfort, engagement, and morale at home. For that, they need to have well-equipped offices. And that's why companies are going to be doing so much better off if they fund the home offices of their employees.
I agree. In the book you write, there's chapter 3, mental blind spots leading to disastrous decisions on returning to the office. Talk about that, these mental blind spots that CEOs are just not seeing because they're blind spots.
Right, exactly. That's what blind spots are. So when I talk about blind spots, I talk about cognitive biases. I know people refer to different things. I'm talking about specifically very academic research, clear academic research on why our brain is miswired. So cognitive biases are dangerous judgment errors that stem from the wiring of our brain. Our brain is not adapted to the modern environment. If you think about it, the internet has been around since the 1990s, right? We haven't had time to evolve for it. Our intuitions, our emotions, our reactions, our feelings, our gut reaction is wired for the savanna environment. And we lived in small tribes of 50 people to 150 people. We had to survive based on the fight or flight reflex. So this is not the modern environment that we live in, but that's what we're wired for. As a result, we make a series of dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. And you can take a look at the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. There's over 100 of them. I have a book out on this topic called Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, which is what Peter and I discussed in the previous episode. So that is something that you can check out if you want to learn more about the general cognitive biases, but specifically to returning to the office, what I talk about in my new book, Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, there are several cognitive biases that are very dangerous for leaders. And leaders we see are making terrible decisions even at the highest level companies. Now, Google was for many months saying that when vaccine is widely available, they'll force everyone to go back to the office. And once vaccine became widely available, people at Google started complaining and resigning and leaving elsewhere. And Google had to change its tune on June 5th, so long before the Delta surge, and say that, we screwed up, and I'm sorry, on May 5th, and we screwed up, that was a problem. We'll let up to 20% of our workforce work fully remotely because they were losing billions and billions of dollars from employees leaving, and cost of replacing them is pretty high because, these are tech people. Same thing on June 10th happened to Amazon, another $1 trillion company. And then on June 24th, Uber, again, changing their tune. So we see that top leaders at the very highest levels are making pretty bad decisions. And why is that? Well, it's because of these cognitive biases. It's not because they lack data. It's not because they lack decision-making prowess. They run the biggest companies we have here in the United States. And of course, that means in the world. So what is happening is that these leaders are falling into several blind spots. One of the biggest ones is called the status quo bias. So what's the status quo bias? The status quo bias refers to us having a desire to maintain or get back to something that we perceive as the right way of doing things, functioning, being. So the status quo. Now in the savanna environment, in ancient savanna environment, was very important for us to maintain the status quo. It was a very precarious environment. So any threats to our survival would be serious dangers, and changing the status quo was likely to lead us to not survive. Therefore, we have a strong drive to get back to the status quo. Similarly, leaders like the leaders of Google and Amazon have a strong drive to get back to the status quo that they perceive as successful, the office. They want to be successful. They want to be in control. They want to be surrounded by their followers. They like that. They feel comfortable, and they feel that that's how they know how to lead. And of course, that's a big, big problem. So that's one, the status quo bias. Another one is called the false consensus effect. So the false consensus effect, that's where leaders believe that others in their tribe, again, going back to the tribalism in the savannah, share the same opinions as they do. So the leaders at Amazon and Google and Uber believe that their employees generally share the same opinions, and that they'll, that what they're saying about not wanting to go back to the office is not serious. I was working consulting for a large peer executive group of many, many thousands of peer executives across the United States and the globe. And they did a survey of their membership, and they found that, and this is for middle market companies, so companies from 50 to 5,000 people, and they found that of these companies, only 44% did surveys of their employees on returning to the workforce. Only 44%. I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it?
Yes.
But that's exactly what happens. They have these false beliefs. So this about what their employees want, this is a huge problem. So we tend to have too much of a belief about what others who are in our tribe, quote unquote, share our perspective. So that's a big problem. So false consensus effect. And related to that is the confirmation bias. How do we look for information? We look for information in a way that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. So leaders, when I talk to them, when I consult before we do the surveys, what often happens is that the CEO talks to the C-suite talks to the senior VPs, and kind of stops there. They all agree that they want to go back to the office, and that's a big problem. And the final thing I want to talk about that's very serious is called functional fixedness. Functional fixedness. We have a certain fixed perspective about how things should function. Once we learn about them, once we know about their function, you might have heard of this as the hammer-nail syndrome. When we have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, when we have a certain way of collaborating, we tend to impose that way of collaborating on all other contexts. For example, in March 2020, the lockdowns happened, and companies overwhelmingly imposed their ways of collaborating on virtual contexts, their in-office ways of collaborating. And it's understandable immediately, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but clearly this has the pandemic has gone on, for over a year, 18 months, and they're still collaborating in exactly the same ways that they started collaborating in March 2020. You can see that from Zoom happy hours. Zoom happy hours are not a fun thing. By now we have research. We had research earlier that they were not great, and we have clear research that they cause disengagement. So by the fall of 2020, we had research that they actually cause disengagement, the opposite of what they're supposed to do, which is cause engagement with teams and so on. But leaders kept doing them and doing them and doing them, and that's not a good idea. And we have a lot of other problems where leaders did not strategically adapt their companies, their organizations to the new environment. Instead, they just kept going with what they know instead of strategically adapting to the future. And I see the same things happening. So that's why my book is titled Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams. I'm seeing the same things happen in the hybrid environment. You need to lead in a very different way for the hybrid workplace. And leaders are not figuring that out, and they're leading in the same old way that they led in fully in-office environments.
I've got a client in Boston, a CPA firm, and prior to the pandemic, they were going to build out more space. They needed more space. The pandemic hit, and then they said, well, we need to slow this down. And then they started surveying their workforce and asking them, when it comes to time, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to come back? Do you want to work remotely? And now they've created this displaced workforce where you can work remotely. I think it's, you're going to talk about it here in a second. They created a very nice hybrid workforce, and they had to go back to the architects and say, we don't need to build this out. We need to condense it some, because we're not going to need all this footprint. Which to me, that's a very progressive firm, because they were part of that 44% who actually did survey their people. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, and this was told to me third hand. you may know that, but apparently Jamie Dimon came out publicly and said, we're all going back to the office.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay, that mentality is probably not working very well for him right now.
No, it's not working very well at all. I actually have firsthand information from some of the investment bankers at the company who quit and they went to work for alternative companies, either Citigroup, so which is kind of a major investment bank that chose not to force its employees back to the office, or smaller investment firms. So there's plenty of opportunities. This is what the Great Resignation is about, where there are plenty of opportunities for people who want to work fully remotely to find a job, the kind of people who can do that. We have about 50% of the American workforce who can work fully remotely. And this is the folks that we're talking about. And right now, if they're made to go back to the office, we see that about 25 to 35% want full-time remote. Well, of that proportion, a large proportion will not accept going back to the office. When we look at how people moving during the pandemic, we know that over 20% of people moved during the pandemic away from their office. I mean, do you think they're going to move back to the office?
Right.
No, this is not the kind of the future. So what we're seeing is that really terrible decision making, and that top people, the ones who have options, the ones who have flexibility, especially are leaving, which is why Google and Amazon, Uber changed their minds, which cost them billions of dollars to change, of course, their plans and lost employees and all of that. But we're seeing that. And some are, like Jamie Dimon, are still sort of staying stubborn.
Yeah, good way to describe it, staying stubborn. I kind of word it this way. His ego is getting in the way of his thought process.
Absolutely.
Very much so.
Because you have to admit that you're wrong. And that is a difficult thing to do for people who are not trained in admitting that you're wrong, who are not trained in debiasing. So that's kind of what my work is about. How do you debias? How do you defeat these cognitive biases? One of the techniques that you need to learn is learning to love figuring out that you're wrong, because then you can be right.
Yeah.
And that is a difficult mental skill to develop. It's not an easy thing to do, to acknowledge and welcome being wrong, because nobody wants to intuitively be wrong. Our intuitions lead us in the wrong direction on this topic. So we need to overcome our intuitions, and overcoming our intuitions, just like changing any mental habit, is a pretty difficult thing to do. So that is one of the difficult things to do that you need to do if you're going to be a really successful business leader.
So you talk about the competitive advantage, and is that competitive advantage basically a hybrid model?
Yes. So what you want to look for in the future. So the 17 companies that I helped transition back to the office, 16 of them adopted a hybrid first model. And what that means, and the team-led hybrid first model. So the specific hybrid model where you don't just go from the top down. So what happened with Apple, for example? Apple just said from the top down, we're going to come back Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. Everyone will come back. This is a serious problem, because this kind of top-down approach, not only is it going to be a problem for people who want to work full-time remotely, and you see people at Apple rebelling, actively writing letters, complaining, and it's very rare for Apple. It's a very compliant workforce usually, and very loyal. And so you see these tech people rebelling at Apple is a big, unusual dynamic. And they're saying, we want to work fully remotely, and also we want to choose the time that we go back. Having everyone go back on the same schedule, it's obviously a bad use of space. So when your architectural firm, that's your client, has decided that we want to condense space, it's also going to be because they get their people who want to come in that hybrid schedule to not come in on the same days, rather than what Apple's doing, right? Kind of bad use of space. That's one dynamic. And then the other dynamic is you want to be really thinking about, okay, why not let team leaders choose? That's where you want the authority. You want to push it down, because team leads, the leaders, lower level supervisors of rank and file members of your employees, of your staff, are the ones best positioned to know what their team needs. So each team has certain different needs and different dynamics, and it does not all the people need to be there at the same time, and they don't need to be there for the same length of time. As a default, a hybrid first model, team-led model, is 1 day a week for everyone to come in. Now, 1 day a week is fine for team cohesion, collaboration, and that once a week meeting for everyone who is part of the team. It also facilitates and strongly encourages having 10 to 20 30, depending on the kind of work you do, of your workforce be fully remote. So allowing people who want to be fully remote unless they are unable to do so effectively. Now, what does it mean to do so effectively? People who want to be fully remote, they need to understand that they need to be taking initiative, they need to be organized, they need to be disciplined, and they need to be good self-advocates, because there are career issues associated with being fully remote when other members of your team are hybrid. So you need to be aware of that and be a good advocate for yourself in the team if you want to have a good career. So there are definitely things that need to be addressed, and not everyone is right for a fully remote role. So most people are going to be best served by coming in for at least 1 day a week. And you don't want to do too much. So then you want to train the supervisors on and give them these broad guidelines, say that encouraging them to let people who can do so to work fully remote, and then everyone else to come back as a default, coming to the office 1 day a week on different days, so you don't have too much occupancy on the same day, and you can cut down your office space and real estate costs. And then you want to train these team leaders on how do they make their decisions. So you want to, how do you make a decision on when to come in? If you don't train them, they'll fall into status quo bias and false consensus effect, confirmation bias, all the other stuff that we talked about. So you want to train them on that. You also want to train them on how to work effectively. And my book talks about how to collaborate effectively, innovate effectively, and do performance reviews effectively in hybrid settings and fully remote settings. So you want to train them on these before they make a decision on how to come back, how many people, how often to come back. And then you want to give them criteria. When you come back, you want to come back only based on the amount of collaboration your team does. Why is that? Well, because individual tasks are overwhelmingly better done at home. People are 20 to 30% more productive on their individual tasks at home. Overall, we're actually more productive at home, something like 10 to 14% more productive across all of our tasks. The collaborative tasks are kind of a wash. Some are more productive at home, some are more productive in the office. And so there's definitely an argument to be made to do some collaborative tasks in the office. For individual tasks, it's way better to do them at home. You don't have nearly as many distractions, you're more focused, you can concentrate, or if you like the buzz of other people doing work around you, you can go to a co-working space, or you can even go to the office if you want that, or you can go to a coffee shop or something like that, depending on your preferences. But that's kind of a much better place to do your individual tasks without being forced to come into the office. And so you want that balance. You want to, any team leads, those supervisors who want people to come in more than 1 day a week, to submit a plan justifying how, based on their amount of collaborative work, why they should be doing more than 1 day a week in the office.
It's quite interesting. You think, because this is the future of work, do you think eventually we'll get most organizations to buy into this hybrid type of an approach, or begin to go down this path who are still resisting it today?
I would be very surprised if we don't, because they will be left behind in terms of getting talent. People are our greatest resource. That's a very accurate phrase. Your systems can be competed away, your products, your ideas. It's people who are your greatest resource, your people and your culture. If you are not going to be satisfying your people, the ones who can work fully remotely, if you're not going to be satisfying them, they will leave. A, they will leave to go elsewhere. B, you will have a bad culture because people will be unhappy if they stay. The ones who can't find a job elsewhere will not be the best people. So over time, the companies that are trying to force their employees back to the office are going to be that, and 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 back to the office, which is not having a hybrid model. These are the companies that will definitely be left behind. And it's very sad. And you're seeing some really good companies. Xerox is one example, which is forcing its tech employees back to the office, and it's hemorrhaging people. And it's a big problem for Xerox. Apple is, people are leaving Apple. People are leaving these companies, and it's not a good fate for these people. Besides the investment banks, Goldman Sachs, and so on that we talked about.
It's kind of interesting because for years I'll ask my audiences when I'm speaking, what business are you in? And they give me everything from sales or auditing, taxation. And I just look at, well, that's a byproduct of the business that you're in. And I get them kind of mad. And they just say, you're in the people business first and foremost. Without people, you have no business, which is simplistic in its thought. I mean, if I treat my people well, they will stay. If they treat them like crap, they're going to leave. But and I still think, I think the industrial age, we were viewed as a number, a replaceable person. That even that is wrong. I've always contended that, you know, we're in the people business. If you treat your people well, they're going to respond. And I don't know, I just get so frustrated. Like, why don't these CEOs understand this simple, easy concept?
It's just the way that people are. They are egoistic, and they tend to want, I mean, especially CEOs. You see a lot of CEOs who are confident. The more confident the CEOs, the less well their company performs. And that there are studies measuring confidence by the kind of statements they make in media interviews, the number of media interviews they do. Their company performance tends to suffer the more confident that they appear in public statements. But the leaders who are desirable, who are desired, are usually the leaders who are more confident, because it matches that alpha monkey male persona from the savannah environment. So they have worse performance, but they match our stereotypes. So they play into our biases of what a strong and confident leader should be. And so these leaders tend to keep moving up, even though their companies do less well. And so they don't have an incentive to not have that strong confidence, arrogant, unempathetic perspective toward people. Now, if they want the company to perform well, they do, but that's not something that many leaders really, who are the kind of people who you're talking about, they really care about. They don't really care about the company. They care about themselves and their salary.
I couldn't have said it any better there, bud. That's exactly what it is. And as I think about this, but it's got to, it's taken notice, because you mentioned, well, we made this decision. Google was the one, and oh no, we made a bad decision. They admitted to it and reversed that. I hope that some of these other companies really start, because the numbers are starting to get staggering on this quote unquote Great Resignation, and it's more than just remote working, but that seems to be a big part of why we're seeing this mass exodus. And I don't know what. So as we wrap up, I mean, you've given a lot of great advice, and if you had to give them one thing, what's the one piece of advice you'd give my audience as they're dealing with this? What do we do as it relates to the future of work? What should we do?
You should not trust your instincts. Your instincts.
Well, because of the biases that you were talking about, right?
Exactly. So your instincts are going to be lying to you about the future of work. You should not be trusting your instincts. You should really be focusing on the data, and you should be analyzing how the cognitive biases that I talked about might be impacting your instincts, not trusting them, not going with your intuition, looking at the data, looking at what your employees want, understanding that, how, like you said, Peter, that your people are driving the success of your company. Your people are the key resource, and you want to satisfy them, make them happy, make them engaged. And because otherwise, you know, you're in a race for the best people, and you will not have the best people remaining if you don't make your people happy. So this is something that you want to go against your instincts around the future of work, and you want to realize that your instincts are based on a backward perspective, on a backward looking perspective, because the future of work, we are in a really key disruptive inflection on the future of work. And you want to see this as an opportunity to succeed in the future rather than as a huge pain point. And in order to succeed, you need to go against your instincts, which are obviously going to be based on your past experience.
About dealing with the uncomfortable, having to go against my instincts, but that was so well put. How can people find you? How can they contact you?
Sure. Well, my book, Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, Benchmarking to Best Practices for Competitive Advantage, is available on Amazon, so check that out. And for me, myself, you can check out my resources at disasteravoidanceexperts.com. That's disasteravoidanceexperts.com. There's blogs, podcasts, videocasts, online courses, books, of course, coaching, training, speaking, all that sort of good stuff. Check out especially disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. for a course on future-proofing yourself against our increasingly disrupted future and making the best decisions. That's again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe.
Before I let you go, what's your next book you're working on?
I am right now spending my time on helping leaders make the best decisions about returning to the office.
Okay.
Not sure what my next book will be on, but right now this is what I'm focusing on.
Okay. Very well put. Well, Gleb, thank you so very much. It's a pleasure always to see you. I love this conversation, and the audience, go get his book. It's got a lot of helpful tips in there, and think about going against your instincts. I get tickled when I say that, but it's true. Think about going against your instincts and make that a daily habit, especially as related to this topic, and take yourself out of your comfort zone and get uncomfortable for a while. So with that being said, thank you very much. Always appreciate it, Gleb, and I'm sure we will talk again soon on my podcast.
Thank you again, Peter.